Hello everyone, in this video we are going to start a new chapter, that is simple bolted and welded connections. So the first topic that we are going to discuss, that is the introduction to connections. So let's start. So whenever we deal with the steel structure, the different steel elements, they are to be connected with the help of the certain fabrication between them. So for example, you can see that a steel structure has been shown to you in which different components are connected together. For example, a beam is connected to the column. That means this beam is resting over the columns. Therefore, the connection has to be provided at the junction of the beam and the column. Similarly, the different beams are connected together. This beam is connected with the cross beam, and similarly the column and the bracket and the column and the base plate, all the connections are possible. So whenever we deal with the steel structure, these members are to be connected. That is a beam with the another beam, a beam with the column, column and bracket, column and the base plate, purlins and the rafter. That is the case of the roof truss, and the stiffeners in the plate girder. And there are many more elements which are to be connected together. Now, depending upon the methods of fabrication available to us, they are primarily classified into three categories, that is rivet joints, bolted joints, welded joints. While the another type of fabrication method can be the combination of the any of these three. That means either we can provide rivet with the welded joint, or bolted with the welded joint, or all of the three. Now, a good connection requires that it should be rigid enough. That means there should not be any relative movement between the different elements that are to be connected, so that fluctuating stresses may be reduced. Similarly, it should be possible that there should not be any weakening of the parts which are connected together, and the connection that we are providing, it should be easily installed and inspected, and if it requires the maintenance in the future, it can be done easily. So that is the requirement from the good connection. Now we will discuss one by one these three types of joints. So the first one is the rivet connection that is to be provided. Now a rivet look like this. That means a steel element which is constructing a shank and a head. That means a rivet is made up of these two, that is a shank and the head. The shank is the longitudinal part of the rivet, while the cap above this longitudinal part, that is known as the head of the rivet. And the corresponding to these two values, we are having different diameters. So the diameter which is corresponding to the head of the rivet, that is known as the rivet head diameter, while the diameter corresponding to the shank of the rivet, that is known as the nominal diameter or the diameter of the rivet, or the normally the diameter simply. So it is also known as the diameter of the rivet, that is the diameter of the cylindrical part which is known as the shank. Now based upon the requirement, diameter of the rivets can be varying, and according to that these different heads are available. Now this rivet head is related to the shank diameter. That means the diameter of the rivet head is dependent upon the nominal diameter of the rivet, and depending upon the nominal size of the diameter that is to be provided for a rivet, we can estimate the plate strength. That means the plate on which this rivet connection has been provided. For example, you can see that this is a connection which is provided with the help of the rivets. So you may have seen these type of connections whenever you pass across the any railway bridges. So the railway bridges provided over the rivers, they are generally made up of these rivet connections because they are the old connections. These rivet connections were heavily discussed in the Indian Standard Code 800, the earlier version, that is of 1984. A separate text has been mentioned for the rivet connection over there. But in the latest code that has been revised in 2007, it does not deal with the rivet connection because it was based upon the working stress method. While the IS 800 2007 code that deals with the limit state method. And that's why this rivet connection is now obsolete and it has been replaced by the bolts. So This is the plate on which the rivet connection has been provided. So this rivet, what is the process for installing the rivets? We provide a certain hole in the plate. Let's say if this is the plate, we provide a hole in the plate for the installation of the rivet, and when we try to install the rivet, we heat up the rivet and it is hammered in this hole which is provided on the plate, and after hammering it is cooled down, and after cooling down it acquires the required shape. That's why this rivet connection requires the heating and the hammering, both the processes, and that's why it was noisy, which is one of the major disadvantages of the rivet connection. So now let's discuss the advantages and disadvantages of the rivet connection. So the advantage is that it is an easy connection. That means in the construction, whenever we are connecting different members, so there is an ease available whenever we are providing the rivet connection. It is permanent in nature. That means once you have provided a rivet connection at a plate, that means let's say these two plates are to be connected together. So you are providing a rivet hole here, and once you heat up the rivet, that means it will expand and it will require the required bolt hole size. Then you will do the hammering. That means you will drive the rivet through this hole between the two plates. So once you have driven the rivet into this hole, that means after cooling down, this rivet will be fixed here. That means this connection cannot be removed from here. It will only be torn apart. That means you need to replace these two plates, and which is the disadvantage of the rivet connection. The connection is permanent, but the replacing of the plates, that is a disadvantage. Another one is that it involves cheaper fabrication cost, because only thing that are required is one hammer and the source of heating the rivet. So cheaper fabrication and low maintenance cost, because maintenance is not there, only the replacement is possible in the case of rivet connection. That's why there is no maintenance. And the major advantage was that it can be provided without electricity. So usually in the rural area, whenever there was not the electricity in the earlier days, so it can be provided without electricity, and primarily in the rural areas. So in the past times when the electricity was not available in the rural areas, then it was very famous. It was the prevalent method of connection, but nowadays it has become obsolete. And that is the one reason that electricity is now available 24/7. That's why the other methods of connections are usually preferred. For example, the welding or the bolted connection. Now the disadvantages of the rivet connections are that it requires preheating. As I've told you that the rivet, whenever we are providing the rivet, it requires the preheating. That means for driving the rivet, you need to preheat the rivet so that it can be driven exactly into the hole. That means it will create a high level of noise, which is the major obligation of the use of the rivet connection. While the labor which is required, that must be a skilled one. So skilled labor required, and since the skilled labor is required, therefore high labor cost. Since the skilled labor is required, therefore the high labor cost. So because of these certain disadvantages, nowadays riveting connections, they are becoming obsolete, and mainly that is because of the noise and the generation of the heat, which is difficult to change the improper insertion of the rivets. Now these rivets are further classified into two categories. That means either you can drive the rivet after preheating them with the help of some machines, that is known as the power driven rivets, or you can drive the rivet into the hole with the hands. So those type of rivets are known as the hand driven rivets. Now this power driven rivet, that is known as the hot rivet, while this hand driven rivet, that is known as the cold rivet. Further, these power driven rivet, these are classified based upon the location on which this rivet has been inserted. That means either it can be power driven shop rivet, or it can be power driven field rivet. Similarly, hand-driven rivet can be classified into two categories, that is hand-driven shop rivet or the hand-driven field rivet. So this is the major classification, and since it was dealt in the IS 800 1984, which was the earlier code for the steel structure and which is nowadays not used, that's why we are not discussing in detail about the rivet connection. Now the commonly used rivets are the snap head rivet and the flat head rivet, and you can see that these are devised based upon the shape of the head which is provided over the cylindrical part, that is known as the shank of the rivet. So based upon the cap that has been provided, these are further classified as snap head and the flat head. Now in the case of the snap head, if the diameter of the shank is d, then the diameter of the head of the rivet that is kept as 1.6 times of the d. While in the case of the flat head, it is taken as equal to the twice the value of the diameter of the shank. Now whenever we are providing the rivet connection, so there are further few assumptions which are to be kept in mind. Although we will not be dealing about this rivet connection in detail, so assumption is that the friction is, that means the different members are to be connected, that means the friction between the members is neglected. Now at a connection you will be providing number of rivets, so rivets in the group, they share the load equally, that means the load whichever coming onto the connection, that is divided equally between the number of rivets. And another assumption is that the rivets fill the hole within which they are driven. The hole is completely filled, and the bending stresses of the rivet, those are neglected. So these are few of the assumptions which are provided in the case of the rivet connection. Now we will take a look on the second type of connection, that is the bolted connection. So this bolted connection, it is done primarily based upon the Indian Standard Code 800/2007, and along with it we follow a handbook, that is IS handbook number 1, because different steel rolled structure, that means the different steel elements, the properties of them are provided in this Indian Standard handbook number 1. So we directly take the properties of these different rolled steel sections from there and we use them. Because in the case of design of steel structure, what we do, we calculate the required stresses. That means the stresses which will be coming onto the elements. And corresponding to those stresses, we select a suitable sections which are available to us from the Indian Standard Handbook number 1. So that we can have a suitable section for carrying out the sufficient transfer of the load. And it does not fracture or does not have any kind of failure. Now, as you can see, the different steel elements are provided with the bolted connection. Now, in any bolt, there is one bolt which is provided in the connection, and along with it, there is one nut which is provided. And in some places, there may be any washer which is provided. So this is the washer which is provided. This is the nut, and this is known as the bolt. So the entire assembly is known as the bolt connection. So you can see the different pictures showing the different types of bolt connections which are provided between the different steel elements. Now the bolt connection has to be studied in detail, that we will discuss all the properties of the bolts. Now this figure shows the different members of the bolt. Now this figure shows the different parts of the bolt. So you can see that this is the nut, while this remaining portion, that is known as the bolt. This portion that is provided at the top, that is known as the head of the bolt, while this portion, total portion, is known as the shank. But this total portion which is not threaded, that is known as the shank, while the portion on which these threads, these cuts are provided, that is known as the threaded area of the bolt. And the point at which this thread and shank are meeting, that is known as the run out section. So the length over which these threads are provided, this is known as the thread length, while the length over which this shank has been provided, that is known as the grip length. and the total length of this connection, that is known as the nominal length. That is known as the nominal length. So because we are going to design the steel elements based upon the different types of bolt which are provided, therefore it is important to know all the components of a bolt. Now depending upon the shape of the head of the bolt which is provided, these bolts can be further classified into different categories that we will see. So the advantages of this bolt connection can be that lesser manpower is required, in this case because in this case whenever we are providing the bolted connection, there is no need to heat up the bolt, and after that there is no need for the hammering, because only what we do, we simply provide the hole on the plate and in that we insert this bolt and we simply tighten the screw so that this grip length is suitably achieved in the connection. Therefore lesser manpower will be required in the case of the bolted connection. Now since there is no requirement for the heating and hammering of the connecting members, therefore it can be made, or the bolting operation which is provided, that is faster than the connection which is provided in the case of rivets. The another advantage is that it is very silent, because the disadvantage of the rivet connection was that it was very noisy and it is a cold process. That means there is no risk of fire involved here, and the suitably it can be removed or maintained. That means the number of bolts can be replaced or retightened easily, because in this there is no fixing of the connection. In the case of rivet it was permanent, while in this case it can be replaced or retightened easily. So what are the disadvantages of the bolt connection? So if it is not a permanent connection, that means it will be having lesser strength in axial tension. Okay, so keep this in mind, that only the strength will be reduced in the case of axial tension. While in the case of vibratory loads, if there are any vibrations, for example in the case of the bridges vibrational load becomes active. In those cases the connection which has been provided, since it has been provided with the help of these tightening these screws, so the connection may get loosened up and therefore it has to be tightened again. And the other disadvantage is that it is having lesser architectural looks, because the major portion of the bolt is remaining over the plate member. So there are different types of bolts which are available to us, and they are classified based upon the different categories. For example, the first classification can be according to the material which is used for the construction of the bolts and the strength. Now based upon the material that we are using, they are classified into ordinary bolts and the high strength bolt. So it is clear from the name itself that the ordinary bolts, they will be having lesser strength than the high strength bolts. So another classification can be based upon the shank which is provided. So based upon the shank, they are classified into three categories, that is unfinished, or they are primarily or popularly known as the black bolts. And the other type of bolt is known as the turned bolt, and the last category of the bolt, that is known as the HSFG bolt, that is high strength friction grip bolt. That means it transfers the load through the action of the frictional force. Now based upon the shape of the nut and the head of the bolt, they are classified into different categories. For example, primarily we are having square shape and the hexagonal shape for the different bolts which are available to us. As you can see in the picture, that the bolt head has been provided in the form of a hexagon. So this is a hexagon having 6 sides of equal dimensions, So this is a hexagonal bolt, while if this head and the rivet which is provided in the connection, they are of square shape, that is known as the square bolt. So depending upon the different types of shapes available to us, these bolts are classified into those categories. On the next lecture, we will look at the different terminologies for the connections which are to be provided. The third type of connection that is to be provided, that is known as the welded connection. Now this welding connection has been provided between the different steel element, and as you can see, this is one steel element and this is another steel element, and the welding has been provided along the periphery of this cylindrical material. Similarly, along with this cylindrical component, a peripheral welding has been provided. So the welding is done through different processes. So different process available for the welding. So they are the forge welding, thermal welding, gas welding, which is a prevalent one, then the resistance welding, which is not so common, and the most popular type of welding, that is known as the electric arc welding. And in the steel elements, we usually take the help of the electric arc welding. So now what are the advantages and disadvantages of the welded connection? So the prime advantages of the welded connection is that there is no hole which is created on the plate. That means we are now completely using the strength of the plate. It means if the connection has to be provided between the two different sizes plates, now we will be welding together them along the gap which is provided there. That means there is no hole which is provided over the plate, and because of that the complete strength of the plate has been using. So that means the complete strength of the plate has been used now. So that is the major advantage of the welded connection. Now because of the welded connection that is provided, since we are not providing any bolt or the rivet, therefore it is having reduced weight of the connection. Because when we were providing the connection between different elements through the bolts or the rivets, so let's say for example we are providing the connection between these plates which are at certain angle with respect to each other, then what we needed to do, we need to provide a gusset plate, a plate which is provided only for the connection. There is no use for this plate other than the connection, so this has to be provided. Now in this case, when we are providing the welding, a bracket plate will be required here, a gusset plate will be required here, but the size and shape of it will be reduced because now we are not providing the hole in that, and therefore we need not to maintain any gap between the different type bolts. We will be simply welding them along the edges of the plates. That means this is to be done as the welding process. Therefore, since we are reducing the weight of the connection, therefore it is an economical connection. So now what are the disadvantages of the welded connection? First of all is that skilled labor is required. A labor which knows how to weld the connection, that is required. Therefore, since if this is skilled labor, that means the connection which is provided between the different steel elements, since it is dependent upon this welding material only, therefore the connection which is provided, it is a brittle one. That means its fatigue strength is very less, and it is even lesser than the strength of the members which are connected at the joint. Now when we are providing the welding, therefore the element which is nearer to the welding area, it gets heated up, and because of the different temperature available in the steel element, these steel elements may distort, and because of that a distorted shape of the connection is obtained. So these are few of the disadvantages of the welded connection. So till now we have seen that there are three different types of connections which can be provided. That is, first is the riveted connection, which was used earlier but nowadays it has becoming obsolete. The second type of connection that was provided, that is known as the bolt connection, and the third type of connection that we are seeing now, that is the welded connection. So there are different types of weld connection that can be provided, and they are primarily classified into three categories. that is the fillet weld. Second type of weld is known as the butt weld or the groove weld. Third type of weld is known as the plug weld. So fillet weld is when we are providing, let's say we are connecting this plate with respect to, we are connecting this plate to this bigger plate, a smaller plate with the bigger plate. That means the welding has to be done only on the edges. Along the edges we are providing the welding. That is the type of a welding that is known as the fillet weld. If we are providing the connection between two different plates, let's say these are the two different plates which are connected together, and if these are connected with the help of the welding material which is filled between the gap that is provided between these two plates, then that type of welding, that is known as the groove weld or the butt weld. While this plug weld, that is provided when we are providing a connection with the help of the plate, and that is provided when we are running out of the effective length for the welded connection. In that case, a plug or the hole has been made in one plate, and because of that, now the required length, now the effective length which is available to us, it has increased, because in the earlier case the length which was available to us, that was only this much, while now the length which is available to us, it has increased by these two distances, while the earlier distance remains constant. So these two are the additional distances which are provided in the case of the plug weld. So we will be looking the design part of these type of welds in the upcoming videos. So till now we have discussed the overview of the all the type of connections that are provided nowadays between the different steel elements. And our Indian Standard Code, the latest one that is in 2007 edition, it allows for the two types of connection, that is the bolted connection and the welded connection. So we will be discussing them in detail. So thank you.